Thank y'all for that rousing. But so I want to welcome everyone here, and as you can see, because I'm standing here first, right? That there's no fancy introductions going to happen here. You just got me tonight. I do actually want to thank everybody for coming tonight. As you notice, this introduction is going to happen just kind of off the cuff here. But like most public lectures that I do here, this is meant to be as much of a conversation as a lecture. So I'm going to talk for a bit, but then I'm going to open it up and we'll just talk. And I want to hear what you have to say and think about critical race theory as well. For those zooming in, the one thing the pandemic did teach us is that we're not geographically bounded anymore. So I want to thank those who are logging in on Zoom. There will be this question and answer. For those on Zoom, you can put your questions in the chat. My dear colleague, George, will be monitoring that and fielding them out. So we want you to participate as well. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we're standing on stolen land. This is hallowed ground that was once occupied by various peoples, including the Miami, the Wea, the Piankashaw, the Shawnee, the Eel River, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Odawa, Chippewa, Wyandot, Kaskaskia, Mohegan, Nantichoke, Huron, and Mohegan. They are not gone. They and their spirits remain as reminders that we have an obligation to not repeat the atrocities to which they were subject to. We honor their spirit and their stewardship of the land on which we now occupy. For those of you who don't know me, and I presume that most people in the audience might, but perhaps some of our zoomed in folks may not. My name is Darryl Heller, and I'm the director of the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center. I'm also a member, an assistant professor, and member of the faculty at IU South Bend in the Women and Gender Studies area. I'm a historian by training, and my interests are in the history of race construction, and particularly the intersection of race and gender. For this talk, which I decided to do because this notion of critical race theory is in the ether, and policies are being set now that some of us think are damaging and dangerous to our children. That it's really important to clarify some of it. So, although I'm not a legal scholar, I do use critical race theory and have, without even knowing that that's what it was called, in my own research, my writing, my activism, and much of what I do. So I will begin. And I'm going to read most of this because it's as you know, critical race theory is a sophisticated theory and framework. And that's what we're here to talk about, what it is and what it isn't, and why it's important in the fight for racial justice. Critical race theory is a provocative view of how race and racial power is deployed in the US and in the larger struggle between the global North and the global South. As Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the intellectual co-founders and practitioners of the movement, noted, critical race theory is a verb, not a noun. It's not something you study, but rather it's a tool to be applied for gaining a critical understanding of the role that race plays in the world and in the society in which we live. Thus, it's impossible to detail all of the complexity in the brief presentation, but I would like to lay out the broad contours in light of the various misrepresentations that have been presented over the past year or so since taking hold in the public imaginary, especially in the right wing and conservative circles. So we've heard all of the ink and rhetoric that's been spewed over the past year, decrying the threat that critical race theory poses to everything that we hold dear in America. As told from the right, critical race theory is the greatest threat facing the country today. Donald Trump called it a twisted doctrine that brainwashes our children. Fox News pundit Sean Hannity calls critical race theory a destructive and far left ideology. In another Fox clip, neurosurgeon and former director of HUD, Ben Carson, it's not just white folks saying this, Carson supported the view that race theory is, quote, the vanguard of a radical revolutionary movement that seeks to overthrow the established order in every area of society, including capitalism itself. Dozens of states, including Oklahoma, Florida, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Missouri, Rhode Island, Iowa, and West Virginia, have introduced bills that will prohibit public schools from teaching divisive, racist, or sexist content. As well, school districts in cities as disparate as Anchorage, Alaska, San Diego, California, Dallas, Texas, and Loudoun County, Virginia, have made moves to bar diversity and anti-racist lessons under the charge that they are a way of slipping critical race theory in through the back door. And closer to home, Attorney General Todd Rokita published the Parents' Bill of Rights in June, in which he asserted that ideologies such as critical race theory attempt to create their own truths through historical concepts and Marxist ideologies, seeking to abolish individual rights and redistribute wealth. A local conservative blog, Real News Michiana, misidentifies critical race theory as, quote, the theory that essentially starts with the conclusion that all white people are inherently racist and oppressors. People of color are victims and oppressed. And it goes on. The theory attempts to fight racism with racism. It is essentially a racist take on communist critical theory, attempting to indoctrinate communist ideals into our children by calling them racist if they disagree with its teachings. And one more layer even closer. Right next door, the Penn-Harris-Madison School District came under fire for using social emotional learning, using a social emotional learning framework that some parents objected to on the grounds that the lessons on implicit bias and microaggressions, specifically those that address white privilege, create stereotypes and can lead to negative self-images. Some parents went so far as to stand out on street corners with signs that read, "Stop critical race theory," which the school decidedly does not teach, before going into the school board meeting to address concerns about social emotional learning. This is especially pernicious because social emotional learning is designed to support the mental health and develop emotional resiliency for students, with lessons on stress management, suicide prevention, and coping with grief. From this perspective, the hysteria that drives the misrepresentation of critical race theory in such vulgar ways ceases to be humorous, but it's downright harmful to the children that these opponents profess to care so much. Now, again, we know that critical race theory is not taught in K through 12, nor is it concerned with intruding into anti-bias or diversity trainings. I say all of this to reassure the naysayers that their children are safe. However, before talking about what critical race theory is and the perspectives that it holds, I would like to share a brief history of its development and why it came into being, because I think context matters. Critical race theory grew out of a realization by a number of lawyers, legal scholars, and activists around the country, mostly in law schools in the mid-1970s and early 80s, that the successes and promises of the civil rights movement had fallen short of creating the kind of liberatory equality that was anticipated. This was in the context of the civil rights movement actually accomplishing what it had set out to do, which was to dismantle Jim Crow laws and explicit restrictions to the ballot, educational opportunities, housing, public spaces, and employment options. As many witnessed with dismay, the retrenchment of Black oppression began almost immediately after progress was made, beginning with Nixon's law and order policy and continuing into the 1980s with Reagan's assault on affirmative action, most effectively expressed through his Black welfare queen stereotype and caricature. State and federal courts also played their role by limiting the amount of judicial relief plaintiffs could expect. What had appeared to be a triumph in a hard-fought war for racial justice was, in fact, simply a provisional victory, but was a provisional victory in but one more battle along a protracted front. Although legal segregation was successfully dismantled and outward signs of subordination were outlawed, critical race scholars and activists, along with many others, observed that the material conditions for most African Americans not only remained unchanged, but were getting worse. It was in this context that the intellectual seeds for what would become critical race theory were planted by Derrick Bell, a lawyer and Harvard law professor. Prior to joining Harvard's faculty, Bell worked with the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, which he joined in 1960. Bell, while with the Legal Defense Fund, he litigated desegregation cases as part of the NAACP's strategy to dismantle Jim Crow exclusions through the courts. Bell left the Legal Defense Fund in 1966 and joined the faculty at the University of Southern California's law school before moving on to Harvard Law in 1969. In 1971, he became Harvard's first Black tenured professor in his law school. Bell published a casebook in 1970 titled Race, Racism, and American Law, which became a core text in his courses. In the preface of that volume, Bell asked a number of pointed and somewhat troubling questions, such as, why do the hard-won decisions protecting basic rights of Black citizens from racial discrimination become obsolete before they're effectively enforced? And what factors stifle vigorous enforcement of laws which in a nation dedicated to individual freedom should never have been needed? He compared the aggressive attack on civil rights gains as a replay of Southern redemption following Reconstruction, and wondered about how racial injustice and the law were related. These were provocative questions for its time and resonated with many of his students who viewed him as a mentor. Thus, they were devastated when he left Harvard in 1980. To fill the void left by Bell's departure, student activists, and particularly students of color, demanded that Harvard continue to offer his course, which was titled Constitutional Law and Minority Issues, which was the only offering dedicated specifically to studying the interaction of race and law. And they also demanded that Harvard hire a Black professor to replace him. The school refused, stating that there were not any qualified Black faculty who merited Harvard's consideration. Besides, the administration argued, wouldn't the students rather have an excellent white professor rather than a mediocre Black one? This provided an awakening for these students who had gone through these interchanges when they realized that liberal institutions like Harvard operated from the belief that merit and color blindness were race-neutral concepts, and that they did not need to be interrogated. Although they disagreed with the university's position, at the time, this group of students would later acknowledge that they didn't yet have the critical vocabulary to articulate all of their disagreements. Instead, so they didn't have all the vocabulary, but they were working on developing a new kind of language and a new kind of analysis in the process. So instead of meeting their demands to have a full semester course, the university offered a 3-week mini course on civil rights litigation. This, however, was unsatisfactory. Students wanted a full semester that would constitute a sustained treatment of race throughout the term. They also wanted something more than a survey on legal remediation. They were more interested in grounding their studies in a thorough understanding of how law constituted the problems of race in this country in the first place. So rather than accept Harvard's offer, they organized an alternative course and invited Black scholars to come to Harvard and give lectures on themes laid out in course's text. This alternative course proved to be a valuable step in the development of critical race theory, in that it was one of the first time that legal scholars of color came together to address the law's treatment of race from a self-consciously critical perspective. To them that it was important and valuable to challenge the terrain in terms of dominant legal discourse. These students recognized that neither Harvard nor other mainstream law schools had the final say in what topics or viewpoints were worthy of being curricular entries. In other words, they made an important connection between knowledge and politics, and even more importantly, the relationships of both to racial power. The context of these early formations and insights for what would become the foundations of critical race theory is an important part of the story. Bell and his students had lived through and witnessed the struggles, violence, resistance, and victories of the civil rights movement. When Bell left the Legal Defense Fund in 1966, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were still new. He began his academic career just before the civil rights movement achieved one of its last major victories with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Even then, though, Bell was skeptical of the lasting significance of these successes and was even more disheartened as he watched affirmative action, the set of remedies that were instituted to correct the historic injustices endured by Black people, come under full-scale attack. The first assault came through the Supreme Court in the case of DeFunis versus Odegaard in 1974, which entailed a white applicant at the University of Washington Law School charging that he was denied admission because of the school's affirmative action policy, which he alleged favored the admission of minority students over better qualified white applicants. Although the Supreme Court never ruled in this case, it did offer an opinion, which was that preferential treatment under the guise of affirmative action is an imposition of one form of racial discrimination in place of another. The question that must be asked, the court said, in this regard, must an individual sacrifice his right to be judged on his own merit by accepting discrimination based solely on the color of his skin? How can we achieve the goal of equal opportunity for all, if in the process we deny equal opportunity for some? This opinion, of course, disregards the fact that Black people's individual rights to be judged on merit have been denied precisely because of the color of their skin for generations. DeFunis was followed by the case of Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, in which the Supreme Court did rule in 1978. This case, well known in legal circles, involved another white man who was twice denied admission to the University of California Medical School at Davis. He charged his denial was due to race because the university had set aside a certain number of spots for qualified minority applicants. The charge of reverse racism soon came after and entered the mainstream lexicon, becoming a rallying cry for whites who charged that Blacks were being given an unfair and unconstitutional advantage through affirmative action programs. The court, for its part, offered no single majority ruling in this case, but in the end, it did order that Baki be admitted to the medical school. And the majority also ruled or offered an opinion that using race as the sole criteria for admission was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. It made a lukewarm concession by allowing race to be one of a constellation of factors in admission, but the damage was done. Race, as a defining argument for being excluded, was no longer legally viable. The very tool that African Americans had used to fight for justice was now being used against them as a weapon to thwart further advancement. Critical race theorists would later come to recognize that affirmative action itself was complicit in creating its own limitations. A central argument of the civil rights movement was that Jim Crow laws violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. The strategy for resolving these inequities was to fight for formal equality by way of prohibiting explicitly racial exclusions. The logic of this tactic was sound. Overt evidence of discrimination and exclusion was abundant, from whites-only signs in public spaces to segregated educational systems that undereducated Black children in underfunded schools, all of which was premised on keeping Black people in a politically, economically, and educationally subordinate position in society. Eliminating these forms of legal discrimination was a laudable goal, but the strategic argument that the fight was about equality as in equal access and equal opportunity came with a high price. As it turned out, this notion of equality was a double-edged sword. Equal access to opportunities and resources with the expectation that the government would guarantee equal protection rested on the assumption that the ideal society should be colorblind. Closely related to this ideal is the belief that individual merit, not race, should be the standard by which one should make decisions and by which one should rise. These were not new concepts, and in fact are at the heart of what it means to live in a liberal democracy. In such a society, race has no place in deciding access to opportunities, resources, or social goods. Hence, by removing explicit markers of race, the very meaning of race was narrowed in a public and legally recognized way. Ironically, though, using race as a rationale for special accommodations to correct historical injustice, which was the whole purpose of affirmative action, became identified as racist against white people. Programs or policies that employed mechanisms such as preferential treatment, quotas, set-asides, and others to support Blacks and other historically disadvantaged groups were quickly ruled as unconstitutional under the new common sense of colorblindness. In essence, the moment Blacks were poised to more fully exert their rights, the door which they finally managed to crack open was quickly reconstructed by the dominant racial power structure's clever manipulation of claims to equality that they must apply to white people, who then became victims of further Black advancement. By the 1990s, as critical race theory was coming into its own, this new ideological framework had matured to ruthlessly and systematically begin dismantling many of the reforms, programs, and advances made during the civil rights period. Buttressing the insistence that society is now colorblind was the belief that our capitalist economy and liberal democratic political system was equipped and up to the task of dispensing constitutional protections to all in a fair and unbiased way. Under the new regime, cases of discrimination were, and still are, treated as an exception rather than the norm. In other words, the mainstream view held that the fundamental structures of society actually work quite well and need not be tinkered with in any substantive way. In the rare cases in which discrimination does occur, the courts apply a legal strict scrutiny to address it, which means special accommodations on the basis of race can only be justified if there is an overarching governmental interest, and any accommodations must be tailored as narrowly as possible to achieve the stated goals. This very high bar makes it increasingly difficult to successfully litigate cases of racial discrimination, and even more so with our current conservative judiciary. With race essentially off the table as a basis for grievances and legal redress, society has, according to the conservatives and right-wing ideologues, achieved its highest form as a meritocracy. Hiring decisions for jobs and admissions to institutions of higher learning are based on who is most qualified. Seldom, if ever, however, are the power dynamics of who sets the criteria for qualifications and merit questioned. Even more troublesome is the fact that many of the same people who made hiring and admission decisions under Jim Crow remained in power in the post-civil rights era, carrying the same ideological baggage that were institutionalized in the era of racial discrimination. In the end, while the visible surface of racial domination was given a makeover, the guts and bones of white supremacy remained untouched. Efforts to understand this phenomenon posed as the question by Derek Bell: why hard-won decisions protecting basic rights of Black citizens from racial discrimination become obsolete before they're effectively enforced, is what animates the work of critical race theory. And I share this history because I believe that it is important to understand that critical race theory did not develop as an abstract theory, nor did it arise out of thin air, decontextualized from real-world events. Its key tenets, to which I want to turn to now, are grounded in observations and in the lived experience of its practitioners. Given the breadth and depth of structural racism and the task of exposing and uprooting it, there actually is not one singular definition that captures the full range of critical race theory. And scholars of critical race theory have multiple concerns. However, there are premises that most critical race theorists all coalesce around, and that they use to challenge the ways in which race and racial power are constructed and represented in American culture and society. One of the first tenet of critical race theory is that race is socially constructed, unsurprisingly. And this, for most of us, is not a controversial position. However, it does have implications in the fight for racial justice. Conservatives argue that since race is a social construct, it doesn't or shouldn't exist. And it certainly shouldn't be a factor in determining social worth. Critical race theorists' response is that the fact that it is socially constructed doesn't make it any less real. Race, critical race theory scholars and activists assert, is everywhere and a dominant feature in the distribution of social goods and benefits. Much of the task of critical race theory is exposing the ways that race and racism continue to operate in all sectors of American society. A second tenet is that racism is normal, ordinary, and pervasive. It is not an aberration. Contrary to the insistent view that we live in a colorblind society, Critical race theorists believe that racism is integral to American social systems and institutions. This is borne out in the everyday experiences of people of color in a myriad of ways, despite, or more likely because of, its social construction, which after all arose as a way of rationalizing slavery and the domination of non-white peoples. A third tenet: white supremacy serves important psychic and material interests. In a superficial way, this means that white people, as a group, not only benefit from the ways that laws and policies are structured to preserve the advantage of white skin privilege, but they also gain what W.E.B. Du Bois called a psychological wage. This perspective was captured in the title of Bell's 1992 influential book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, which the title alludes to the satisfaction that even the lowest white person at a level just above the bottom of the well of social hierarchy, the satisfaction that that person could take looking down and seeing Black people still below him. On a deeper level, Derek Bell advanced the interest convergence theory, which he stated bluntly as, the interest of Blacks in achieving racial equality will only be accommodated when it converges with the interests of whites. There's not time to take this argument fully to its conclusion, but historical evidence bears this out. From Reconstruction and all of the promises from Reconstruction and all of its promises, which benefited the reunification of the nation after the bloody Civil War, to Brown versus Board of Education, which we think as a seminal case, but it was a partial response to the tarnished image of the US during the Cold War. It was a way of cleaning up its international vision, perspective. The fragile thread of converging interests is also exemplified by the number of whites who voted for Obama in one election and then for Trump in the next. What happened? Bell lays out this view much more fully in his seminal essay that's titled Brown versus Board of Education and the Interest Convergence Theory, which I highly recommend reading. Another tenet of critical race theory is that racialization is differential. It changes as the need for the dominant power shifts to maintain hegemony. This proposition holds that different racial groups can be racialized differently depending on time and place, though all non-white groups are viewed as subordinate to those who are considered to be white. From this perspective, race as a social construction is contextual and operates differently for different racialized groups depending on the interests of the dominant power structure. For example, a dark-skinned Puerto Rican may be categorized as Black in an urban environment in New Jersey, but seen as not Black in a Southern context. This is similar to Indigenous and Chicano people who found themselves on the US side of the southern border after the land grab following the Mexican-American War in 1848, who are alternately defined as Caucasian when it suited the Texans for the purpose of representation in Congress, and then tossed back into the mass of non-white people when they were no longer needed. Differential racialization can also apply to white people, as was the case with the Irish in the 1830s, who were decidedly not seen as white until later in the century after they had proved their racial bona fides by out-racing the racist. Another tenet: each race has its own origins and evolving history. Related to this is that everyone has intersecting identities that cannot neatly be disaggregated. In one sense, this simply notes that no group is homogeneous. Each member of a racialized group holds not only the identity that anchors them to that group that they're assigned. But they also carry other identities that are significant and socially meaningful. The term that's often used for this is intersectionality. For example, I am a black, cisgendered, straight, able-bodied male. I'm also unmarried, middle class, and a father. These are all socially meaningful categories of identity. The complexity of these identities is significant on multiple levels. As a man in a patriarchal society, I have some modicum of privilege to exert masculinity in certain environments and contexts, namely, in all Black environments, in all Black mixed-gendered situations in which Black men are the majority. In this case, my maleness has historically elevated me above Black women, such that I and other Black men have been able to dominate women of color in most areas that matter. Although there are women of color and Black women represented in spaces that matter and have social weight, patriarchy all but guarantees that the men will remain dominant, and Black women in particular will all too often be relegated to secondary subservient roles. If they do achieve positions that they deserve and are qualified for, their voices will often not ring as loud as their Black male counterparts. And it doesn't even need to be said that my privilege as a Black male evaporates the moment I step into a white space. Kimberly Crenshaw also showed how intersecting identities can expose the exclusion and erasure of Black women's political and economic identity by critically examining judicial rulings. In one case, DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors, she found that 5 Black women brought a lawsuit against General Motors on race and sex discrimination, alleging that the company's seniority system perpetuated past discriminations. As part of the findings, it was determined that although the company hired white women prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, all of the Black women employees had been hired after 1964. When the company hit an economic slump and had to lay off some workers, the seniority policy of last hired, first fired meant that all the Black women lost their jobs. The women filed their suit on the grounds of both race and sex discrimination, not just as women, just as Black, but as a category of Black women. The court rejected this offer, ruling that the company had not discriminated on the issue of sex because they hired women, even if they were all white before 1964, and retained women after the layoffs, even if they too were all white. The court refused to even consider the case on the basis of race, recommending instead that these Black women join a discrimination lawsuit initiated by Black men in the company. The court clearly stated that it was not willing to recognize Black women as a new protected class but was not going to accept them as a newly constituted class by considering their intersecting identities as a unitary category. So in so deciding, Black women were left vulnerable in this glaring legal blind spot. Finally, voices of color are necessary because of their unique position to the dominant power structure. Critical race theory believes in storytelling. Voices other than those of the dominant white experience or filtered through a white lens are necessary to destabilize the dominant narrative and power dynamic. As importantly, perceptions and experiences from non-white people are critical to generate any sense of empathy and to understanding the commonality of our human experiences across racial lines. For example, I believe that the material interests and conditions of poor white rural Appalachians have much more in common with poor Black urban residents in the south side of Chicago than they have with white corporate executives, white party bosses, or the white 1%. However, if the only story that Appalachians hear are white voices that denigrate Black people in Chicago's South Side as irresponsible, violent, or socially deviant, they don't have the capacity or framework to think about or know Black people in any other way. Storytelling that gives voice to the lived experience of minority groups can challenge the dominant narrative and create the possibility of finding not only shared experiences, but perhaps create the possibility for the formation of coalitions that is in the mutual interest of both groups. These themes, taken together, constitute a frontal attack on the view that America is an inherently just society whose systems operate in a fair, equitable, and an unbiased manner across racial lines. In fact, Derek Bell held the belief that racism was so deeply embedded in American institutions that it would never be eradicated. While this position is not universal, most critical race theorists are certain that real justice and equity in American society will require a whole-scale transformation of its structures and institutions and the creation of a new vision of human relations. The breadth of critical race theory's critical inquiry and methodology lends itself to looking at race and racial power from several different angles and perspectives and disciplines. Legal scholars may examine race and social structures through such questions as, how has the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution been applied? What does the rule of law really mean in a racialized society? Is the law rational, or does it lend itself to political interests and whims? And these are not just rhetorical or abstract questions, but they're critical, but they are a critical examination of the material world whose answers have real life consequences. Other scholars and activists may explore the notion of merit and the concept of meritocracy, a cornerstone of mainstream American ideology and self-identity. A critical exploration may ask questions such as, what does a meritocracy look like if everyone is not starting from the same place and subject to the same criterion? How is access to opportunities distributed? What are the characteristics of a society that treats all of its members equally? What structural or institutional barriers are there in the ways of achieving equality so that merit actually has meaning? An educator may ask questions about what produces disproportionate suspensions and expulsions of Black kids. What are the biases inherent in standardized testing? Why do gifted programs all too often Black children, while special education programs welcome them with open arms? What are the power dynamics in curricular decisions? And of course, as a historian, in which I'm interested in how race is constructed and the ideology that co-creates that construction, I see race as a defining feature and characteristic of America from its genesis to its present. I'm interested, like other critical race scholars and activists, in not only understanding or theorizing about structural and institutional racism, but as importantly, how to transform those institutions and structures into ones that recognizes the humanity and dignity of everyone and operates in a just manner. To use a medical analogy, critical race theory is a good diagnostic tool in which to see the disease of racism that functions like a cancer on America's soul. Previous surgeries, led by movements for justice by Black people fighting for freedom and inclusion, apparently only drove the malady deeper into the body. The civil rights movement was able to heal some of the most outward signs of the tumor. Whites-only signs were outlawed, and overt discriminatory practices that previously excluded Black people from employment, education, housing, and other opportunities were, at least in visible ways, eradicated. This was a hopeful sign that perhaps a new day was dawning, but that hope faded almost as soon as it found its way to light. The tumor remained, once again, showing its resiliency and tenacity by metastasizing again. We have not even begun to touch its roots, which remain entangled in all of America's structural bones, and racism's heart continues to beat in everyday practice. This is why critical race theory is important. As a methodology, the critical part is the tip of the spear. Its task is to look deeply at the racialized nature of social systems, and provide a theoretical vocabulary by which to formulate an alternative vision for progressive racial political action. As a theoretical framework, it shifts the lens of analysis and examination to center race as its North Star in order to account for the contradiction of how racism continues to exist in a purported colorblind society. So before I end, and I'm almost done, before I end, I want to return to where I started, with the hysteria that critical race theory is antithetical to everything that is American. The Florida State Board of Education approved the rule advanced by Governor Ron DeSantis. Some of you may have heard of him, which limited what could be taught in K through 12 schools. This rule read, instructions on the required topics must be factual and objective and may not suppress or distort significant historical events, such as the Holocaust, and may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. DeSantis justifies this position by declaring that no child should be classified as a victim or oppressor based on their race or ethnicity. Race essentialism in any form is destructive, especially in a diverse society where each person should be judged only by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. I quote. And the irony is dripping everywhere. This mandate to require that topics must be factual and objective and may not suppress or distort significant historical events. It's exactly what many proponents of critical race theory would support. The one thing I would change, and maybe other critical race theorists as well, is that DeSantis didn't have to reach across the ocean for an example. Slavery would have done just fine. And so I leave you with the words of James Baldwin, who reminds us that not everything faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Critical race theory gives us the tools to face what needs to be changed. Whether or not we actually do remains to be seen. Thank you. Thank you. So I really appreciate that. Now it's our time. I want to know your thoughts, or if there's any questions that you have. Great, thank you. And just for those on Zoom who probably didn't hear, the comment was that critical race theory is a tool, but it may not be sufficient. And what we're experiencing now is just kind of a replay of what we saw in the early 20th century, pitting poor people, black poor people against poor white people, so that the kind of unified movement of people together for change kind of becomes almost impossible along the axes of race. Any other thoughts or comments or questions?
Absolutely. So, I came to CP because, much like I think many of you probably thought the gem is, you discussed at the beginning, denying the teaching of critical race theory. And at the time, I didn't really know what it was, or what the broader definition was. So I was really curious to start learning about it a little bit more. And to put it in like a broader sense in my own words or understanding, it's more of a theory of teaching and continuing to teach kind of what's happening in our society today. So, for me, when I was in high school, I did learn about slavery. I learned about a lot of impressive things happening through America's history. And for me, that was enough to understand that it was wrong, and that we as a society need to do a lot more to accept others and ensure that everybody has equal opportunity. So I guess for me, it's kind of crazy that this wouldn't be taught in schools, that we wouldn't want to continue to learn as an American society on how to better have that colorblind society and continue to have that. I do understand kind of the idea that teaching this in a way could give that effect, mostly to kids. It's kind of like, oh, you oppress me, I oppress you, et cetera, et cetera. But I definitely think, sorry, lots of words. Definitely think it is the correct step in the right direction, and being able to learn, especially after the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 1960s, continue this thought process, and still really interested in learning ways to be able to teach other people or to commune with other people, whether it be for or against, to help everyone have better understanding. So I really do appreciate tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I will say that I think most people today would say slavery was wrong. But what folks say is like we fixed it. Like that's the past. We've moved past that. That's the whole notion and utility of arguing for a colorblind society, that why race should not be a factor because we're all equal, right? Certainly after the 1960s, when we kind of cleaned up, the last vestiges of those inequities, inequalities, suddenly, overnight, we could put on this colorblind robe and move on as if, we're operating, on the same plane. Hence, and which clearly the courts agree with, with their strict scrutiny and with kind of assuming that race itself is at best an exceptional versus pervasive in all present, omnipresent reality. So what critical race theory is really doing, and some of the work that it's accomplishing, is actually exposing and excavating the pernicious ways that racism is deeply embedded in institutions itself. Now that the visible signs are gone, we have to dig much deeper to be able to expose it, because we can look at the data, right? We know that the inequities, whether it's health, housing, wealth, you name the category, and the disparities can't just be people. There's something structurally going on that we have to confront.
So I think when you talk about critical race theory, I think about, as a theory, I think about deconstructionism as a theory and thought that really didn't go a long way to do a lot, but be out there as a theory about the way to think about different things. It seems that we do need a tool in America to begin to truly clean up thought and behaviors that continue to disparage people of different race religions. How do you see critical race theory helping people who are maybe in high school now? I know my youngest son will come home and say, "Oh, I don't like that person," or I don't like the way that person thinks because they disparage people of color, they disparage people who have beliefs or sexual beliefs other than their own. So how do you see critical race theory growing so that it really does become more of a tool, even if it's not taught in high schools or in Texas?
Or Florida, for that matter. This in response to the high school, I don't think you need critical race theory for that. I think you just need decent humanity. I think the one of the things you said, which is really important, is that we have to teach the full breadth of American history, right? I mean, that's like a starter. Like, we can't move very far if we're operating from two different worldviews. So as long as we kind of whitewash our history and we leave out significant parts, and particularly the experiences of people of color, I don't think we can even talk to each other in any reasonable way. And I think that's where a lot of us tend to be, a lot of us across racial lines and across ideological lines, where the conversation breaks down, because their reality is this and other folks' reality is that, because they've been taught different things and they haven't heard each other's stories. They don't actually know each other in a real substantive, meaningful way. So the shared experiences never get communicated. So critical race theory is really valuable in that way, as creating, like, really challenging the structures and policies that prevent those kinds of interactions and relations from taking place. And it's one of the ways that I would say that it works. Mark, you had your?
I did. There you go. Please go. Well, first, I just wanted to echo what so many other people say. That analysis and summary of critical race theory was really insightful and very helpful. And so, my basic question is getting back to your notion of this current hysteria. Why now? You did a wonderful job of historicizing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
These ideas have been around nearly 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it such a hotbed issue now, as opposed to in the 80s when Darryl Heller and Convergence and others were formulating?
Well, I mean, repeat the question. Yes, the question. Thank you, George, and sorry to my folks on Zoom. The question is, why now? Why is critical race theory, the attacks on critical race theory and the hysteria that's surrounding it, why is that kind of like the topic now, like in this historical moment. And I think part of the answer, and a big part of the answer, is George Floyd and the racial uprising. And particularly, you know, what we saw, and this was really heartening for some of us, so those of us who've been activists for a long time, what was particular and I think somewhat different than other movements. I mean, the civil rights movement had vestiges of this, but the spontaneous pouring into the street of not just Black people, but white people. The racial uprising last summer was multiracial, it was intergenerational, it cut across class lines. And you know, and some of the most vociferous demonstrations happened in predominantly white cities like Portland, with sustained kind of responses, and the international character of it. I mean, people in Tokyo and Sydney, Australia, and London and Belfast were saying George Floyd's name. And they were using that as a way of rallying around their own local conditions. And so the racism is not unique to America, and people of color in other parts of certainly the Western world responded equally. Just the inhumanity, I guess, of and the fact that we all had to witness it in some cases multiple times because we were locked down in the pandemic. I think it was coupled with because the attacks on critical race theory began last summer, last fall, kind of as the election season began to heat up, and so and I think they're rising now and kind of reaching, kind of continuing to have this upward spiral because we're about to enter another election season. And so in the face of the racial uprising that we saw last summer, and that the real possibility, and there was this moment, and I don't think that moment's passed yet, but this real moment that we could work across racial lines, the injustice and the inhumanity of what we saw with George Floyd just touched so many people that maybe we could break down some of those barriers. And I think that the right, the conservatives, are trying to shore up their constituencies and to reel them back in. So I really think that it had a lot to do about why now. And I think that the theory, the way of articulating the language, the vocabulary is much more developed now. And so the kinds of analysis that's happening is much more sophisticated and present, and I think widespread. Again, people, I mean, just to show, how many, before last summer, how many of you heard of critical race theory before last summer? Like, most people hadn't, right? And how many people have ever heard of Richard Delgado? Kimberly Crenshaw? my point is, these are going to become household names, I think, as we go forward. And certainly, as you know, here in Indiana, they're talking about passing legislation. And my great hope is that kind of in the buzz is that Indiana's going to jump onto that bandwagon, you know, to outlaw teaching race, basically, teaching history, teaching, you know, and that's the way that I think that's the way of the power start to gain power. In the moment when it's been destabilized because of last summer and fall and spring. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Yeah.
I'm here in Dan Gladys.
Yeah, so first, yeah, again, I want to echo what people are saying. Thanks so much for this lecture. It's been really helpful. Well, comment and then a question. So when I reflect on my historical education in high school and junior high in rural Michigan public school, and specifically with engagement with race, I was taught that MLK was good, and he, you know, said that racism was bad, and the whole South was like, no, it's good, and then MLK prevailed, and then we all fixed it. It was good. And there was some business in there about indigenous folks who graciously said, oh, here, like an entire continent for you. And that was it. Like, I mean, I'm being kind of facetious, but that's what I was taught.
Right.
And so when I hear about people talking about teaching critical race theory in school, I think to echo what you just said, what that's coded language for is they're teaching actual history, right? If that is the case, my question is is more of a political question than a historical one. A lot of the rhetoric I've seen around this conversation has been progressive folks saying, you don't even know what critical race theory is. Let me outline what it is, and then you can see how wrong you are. Which still assumes the conservative framing. And I was wondering if you've seen or thought of other helpful framing responses that actually breed helpful dialogue about this very important issue of teaching. I mean, one of the major issues here, specifically with high schools, is teaching actual history. Because I'm afraid that, if I was to go and take these wonderful notes and, respond them to conservative family members or whatever else, it's actually still buying the framing that the conservative pundits have put things into. So would you have any thoughts, and again, this is kind of outside the scope of your specific project, but would you have any thoughts of how to take this information and frame it in broader discourse that doesn't just assume the kind of talking points of conservative media?
Yeah, so let's see if I get the question right. The question is, how do we reframe critical race theory and its associated concepts in a way that can be communicated or can generate conversations with folks on the other side of the aisle, the folks who are more conservative and or more committed to, you didn't say this in my language, but kind of operate from a perspective of white supremacy, even if it's unconscious. And so that's the $64 question, right? I mean, the way I have conversations with people is actually I ask a lot of questions, and so it didn't make it into this. I mean, it was a longer piece that I was working on, but historically, one of the things that most people don't know is that the 1790 Naturalization Act stated clearly in the document that only free white people could become citizens of the United States. If you weren't born a citizen, the only way to naturalize as a citizen was that you had to be white. And numerous immigrants, mainly South Asian and Asian immigrants, were denied citizenship because of that. So I ask questions like, did you know that this document had that in it? And what do you think that means? What kind of implications do you think that had to the character of our country now? Like, why did the country stay predominantly white for 400 years? There's a really interesting book called White by Design, or Nation by Design. But it really looks at it looks at immigration law and the kind of immigration history. So kind of in having those conversations in ways that aren't, that don't put people in the defensive, I think and requires a tremendous amount of patience and a commitment to doing it, because it's often, I certainly gotten to the place where I'm not particularly interested in talking to people that aren't open to having the conversation, a real conversation, because I'm not trying to push an ideology or a position. I want a conversation. And I'm open to being changed. I don't think a white racist, white supremacist can change my perspective, but I'm open to trying. Because that gives me an opportunity. If they're really sincerely open, it gives me an opportunity to actually try to change them as well. And so not I guess not browbeating is the word that came to mind, but that wasn't quite what I'm trying to capture. Not putting them on the defensive or overly aggressively insisting on your position, because that's actually what they're doing. And if they're not open to conversation, then conversations can't be had. Conversation can never be one way. We're glad.
I think the critical way, it gives us a format and a structure to have those conversations that we need to have in an academic way. And the people that make all the rules, and they understand academics. So if you're talking about it in an academic way, that's one way to accept the conversation. The other thing I was going to say is why now? Because we done went through everything else. We done had the Black Panthers, we done had Malcolm X, we're gonna have Dr. Martin Luther King, and we have Barack Obama. So what else is there? Where is they used to say we had one leader. Where is that leader today? So now we have to get to critical race theory to have those conversations that we have to have. And people are sick of people saying, calling people racist. It's not working. People are not changing, so we have to have that transformation and change to take place in this day and time. Why not now? Who else is there? What else is there? Maybe something else will come along, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But it's time for us to have that real conversation so that change can occur in America. I'm concerned about America, I'm concerned about around the world. But so that change can come about. It's like the lady in the back said, with all the things going on today in America, maybe they won't accept it, but we have to have those conversations because things have to change so that social justice can be here, so that equality can take place. Because even in this day and time, we as African Americans, we can say we still a slave. Now, some people wouldn't understand that, but we understand that when we say that. No matter all the things that have happened in this country, today I can say Gladys Muhammad, I'm still a slave. Because of the inequalities that take place. They won't pay us as much money as they pay white women or white men. Mm-hmm. They take people and put them over the top of you, and you've been doing something all the time. And that happens here, right? In South Bend, so it's happening all over. And we try to think about, okay, who's the executive director of anything? Who is the director in our city? And we can't count. So that means still a slave, no matter how high you rise and how much you do, you still, and someone else is going to be over you and try to tell you what to do and how to direct your path. And it's unacceptable. And I like it. I didn't know what it was either, so I came to find out too. But my daughter tried to explain it to me. I'm trying to listen to your kids. But I came to try to understand it myself, but I do understand it more, and I can understand why. And it needs to be in an academic. People accept things more so in academic setting. And and he said the theory, using the word theory is a good way. It's a theory. We're not saying it is so, although some of us may say it is so. But we're not going to have people not going to take it if we say that. And the George Floyd, it was in our face. How could we deny that happened? And how could the world deny that happened? And that was like the last straw. And we want things to change. We want, as this lady said in the back, we want people not to be killing each other and all this. But it all has to do with race. And people need to understand that. And oppression and depression and trauma. And if that's one mechanism or tool that's going to help us have that dialogue and conversation and make change occur, then I think it's great.
Great, thank you, Gladys. Jay.
Quote from Ron DeSantis, I think, and one other article about no child should be made to feel a victim or oppressor. It begs the question, is the real objection here to teaching history to kids, real history, which makes them feel sad or ashamed for what happened in the past? Is that the real objection that people have to what's happening?
So I don't think so. I would say, so the question is statements about teaching the history of race makes people feel bad, or particularly young white kids feel bad or ashamed? Is that the real objection to the reactions to critical race theory and to teaching much more broadly the racial history of this country? Is that? And I think it's about power. I mean, I don't think it's about feeling bad. I think that feeling bad is just an excuse. You know, it was just, it's quite startling. The Funes case is 1974, which was 6 years after the Fair Housing Act. You know, less than 10 years, 10 years after the Civil Rights Act. 10 years, right? Suddenly, after, you know, what was it then, 150 years of freedom, 100 years of freedom from emancipation, but 200 years from before then or so. And then within 10 years, we're now colorblind, right? And that was a power move, I think. And I think that maintaining or the reactions that we're experiencing around the reaction to critical race theory now is about the white power structure trying to use all of its tools and tactics to maintain that power, and particularly to keep people like me and you from talking to each other. Or, you know, as you were asking, Spencer, you know, like talking across ideological differences. Because the sensibility, and this is my personal beliefs, is that we all have some humanity in us, and if we touch each other, and if we put two narratives together, we can all empathize with the person who's been oppressed. But if we don't see them as oppressed, or we see it as their oppression as their fault, then we don't have to respond in any kind of human way. We can just write them off and blame them, and we since we have this what do you call it, thing of individual responsibility. So, you know, if you don't succeed, it's your problem, your fault. I don't have to be empathetic. But if we actually learn the more nuanced ways that oppression not only happens, but it continues to be reinforced or reiterated. And if we can actually see that, like that poor white Appalachian and poor black Chicagoan, like I would love to see that conversation. I would love to make that conversation happen. Because I think that those are the two groups that the wedge the power structure is terrified of them coming together. When we saw that with Fred Hampton, and some of you may know this story, with Fred Hampton in Chicago, when he was bringing the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, and the Black Panthers together, black, brown, and white people all together. I mean, the man was 21 and they took him out because I think the raw power of what that coalition could do together, and the power structure does everything it can, and not teaching the history is one way of making sure that we don't cross those lines. And that's part of how I think about it. The other Jay.
I think you partially answered it. What I among many things that you said that struck me was that we need to interrogate assumptions that underlie the institutions that we're part of. So first step is those kind of conversations that you just mentioned across lines. But it seems like there's two kinds of people, right? You know, those who say, yeah, we ought to interrogate the assumptions, and they're called liberals, or they're called fill in the blank. And then others who say you're un-American if you question anything in America that exists. Is somehow perfect or so on. And that institutional blindness is just really the next. You know, it'd be great if the two people get together across, but then the institutions, in my doubt is that they'll, you know, even if the two people from different backgrounds get together and they understand one another and begin that empathic process, the institutions will just wipe that out. So what do we do at an institutional level to challenge those assumptions? And that's what critical race theory is about. You know, but then it gets shot down by the institution. So I don't know what I'm asking other than help.
No, the question or comment is really about what do we do on an institutional level? It's like we can possibly work as individuals to talk to each other, but we're all in these institutions are deeply embedded. So how do we respond to the structure that's really propping it up and perpetuating? Because it's the structures that decide what curriculum is going to get in these institutions to decide what curriculum gets taught in school, what kinds of history you learn. You know, it's a hard one, and obviously I don't have the answer because I wouldn't be here. I'd be somewhere doing something really smart. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, institutions are people too, right? Are composed and comprised of people. A lot of energy and resources go into maintaining them, though. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, Jay. But I'm working on it.
Well, we can at least point to the rhetoric and the missions of our institutions. You know, Martin Luther King was great. Like, what about this, you know, Declaration of Independence and this equality? And where are we? You know, like the good question you mentioned. But it's a longer process, and then people fade out. People are replaced.
Yeah, and I think that what we do is we do what we can where we are. And I think about the students at Harvard, right? Like they could have acquiesced to Derek Bell leaving, but they kind of decided they were going to take another course, and you know, and they had some insights, you know, that how power is distributed isn't the way it has to be distributed. There's other ways of doing it, and one of the points that Kimberly Crenshaw has made is that this notion of a meritocratic society, like an individual effort and qualifications and all of that, that's legit, you know, but it's not the only legit way we could see the world. We can organize society and structures in different ways that have equal legitimacy. The fact that it's organized the way it is a political decision. I mean, this is serving some interest. I mean, it's what I tell my students all the time is whenever you see something or hear something like this law was passed, the question you should ask, whose interest is being served and who's winning in that, who's gaining from that particular choice and who's not. And these you should ask just across the board kind of constantly when you see social changes or institutions are moving in a particular direction or setting policies in this way. There's generally an interest behind it and being able to identify, and that's part of the criticalness of critical race theory and why it's important, is that we interrogate and ask those kinds of questions. And then once we find the answers to them, then it's kind of on us to organize and to do something. There's a question right behind you before Peter.
I guess I was going to say that I think that people who advocate that all history be taught, and that we teach complete history, I think that we need to be just as vocal as the people who are opposed to critical race theory and all that they think that encompasses. I'm a teacher, and what I see is that the cycle, students move through us so quickly. I mean, change happens so quickly. We only have them for 4 years. The window of time we have with them is, you know, maybe 6 years if you're talking middle school and high school. And we have an entire generation here of teachers who are kind of intimidated by all of these parents who are opposed to critical race theory. I mean, it's no fun to have an angry parent who's mad at you because they think that you have
Brainwash their child, perhaps.
And so we need people who want us to diversify our texts and to diversify our curriculum to be just as vocal as the people who are saying, who are, you know, freaking out about it. Because I think that educators also need that support and to know that there are other people who want to make sure that they're being exposed to this.
So, yeah, go ahead, help. Do you have a response to that?
I was going to jump into the
Yeah.
education section. Just only
I hope, but just introduce yourself real quick.
Okay, I'm Hope Davis, the Dean of the School of Education at ISFN, so teacher, I figured. So I just wanted to say that thank you, Daryl, for doing this as well. Secondly, I love the conversation about the teaching of history and the discussion about how critical race theories inform the teaching of history. But when we think of education,
critical race theory actually touches on so much more than just which story of history is told. And I think that's an important element for us to think about. Just as a small example, No Child Left Behind was a law that was passed years and years and years ago that most teachers in the room have blown about. Self-equivalent. One good thing about No Child Left Behind, is that the first time ever it required schools to disaggregate data based on race. So for the very first time, schools actually had to look at how students from various backgrounds, various economic groups were performing, and then they had to explain, why is it that this particular group of students is doing this way and this particular group isn't? That's a direct result of researchers previously finally saying, maybe we should look at data based on race. We think there's something going on here. Maybe we should look and separate out. And that connects directly back to Darryl Heller and his students who thought, let's look at law from the perspective of race. So critical race theory education does encompass this idea of having the whole story told, but it's not just about one particular curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. You have time for one or two more. Peter.
Yeah, the one thing I'm not hearing tonight is the conversation about church. And when we talk about the institutions, church is right out there with certainly a subject that needs to understand critical race theory and willing to have conversations about it. There is a new ally in town. Some of you may know Father Dan Moran, who's he's a Franciscan friar. He has just been made the director of the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's College. Of course, St. Mary's College has always kind of been on our side and on the edge. But Father Dan was formerly a professor at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. His new book, which was published by Ave Maria Press, is directed to us white folks. He calls it a white problem and announces that he wishes to direct this material to the parishes and churches in the United States, primarily. Talks primarily about white privilege and systems of power. Those are his two themes in this new book. So I'm not here to sell Dan's book, but I look for, as a social justice minister at St. Pius Church, who spent 10, 11 years of almost fruitless work, the resistance that I've had from the power of the church has created an atmosphere, continues to hold an atmosphere of resistance to an honest conversation using a tool such as critical race theory. So I don't know. All I can say is there's an institution that I think we all say falls short for white folks out there that needs to find a way to. Of course, I can't speak for all churches, and maybe I'm prejudiced about my own circumstance, but I get those white folks to become Christians is just. You should talk to the boss.
I think that racism is the root of all evil, not sin.
Yeah, one.
So just want to mention we had about peak of about 40 people online, in addition to the people here, so it's just, as a turnout. Just one question though, and this comes from Susan Sharp, who I believe is probably watching from Vancouver, British Columbia. And it's a great ending question, so I wanted to say that for who might be last. What else do you recommend as must-reads for helping us appreciate the role of critical race theory or see our responsibility in applying it?
So what else do I was recommend for reading for critical race theory?
Yeah, or responsibilities of applying critical race.
Yeah, so there's a couple of really good books. Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Race is a good book. It's a non-traditional academic kind of book because it's really stories, but the stories really have no messages in them, or there's a deep analysis in the story. The kind of, I think I've heard a number of folks say this, a good introduction to critical race theory is a book simply called Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. It's by Richard Delgado and his wife. But it's written for the average person. It doesn't require, 5 degrees in a legal and 10 years of legal scholarship, to be able to actually comprehend what it's saying. That particular book that does require that kind of is another book called Critical Key Writings That Formed the Movement. It's the early writings, and it's Kimberly Crenshaw was one of the editors of it. It's an anthology of some of the key legal scholarship that formed the theoretical foundation for critical race theory. And there's a second volume to it, Critical Race Theory. Actually, we have it in our shelf there. It kind of has more later and updated theoretical and legal scholarship around a range of topics, because as Hope said and others have said, critical theory, which is what critical race theory grew out of, and critical race theory itself has really generated critical explorations for other groups. There's critical Latin studies, there's critical LGBTQ studies, there's critical white studies to really interrogate whiteness, and primarily done by white people or white scholars. So there's a range of books and texts to explore those deeper. And I would just say read as much as you can about just history, and particularly the history of race. And there's the list of the kind of scholarship, the kind of writing, the kind of research that's happening now is just phenomenal of what's out there. Anybody who's really interested, if you send me an email, I will send you a list as long as your arm of different texts that would be useful to read. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for coming. And so, yes. All right. Great, thank you.